and welcome to Cult Movie Cult, where we watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I am Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink.
Today we will be continuing our series on Peter Jackson, Before Middle-earth, the early films of Peter Jackson. This will actually be the last episode of Part 1, which is the early films of Peter Jackson.
And in terms of violent horror films, you know, nothing else Jackson has made will meet the next one that we're going to talk about. I think I hear the sounds of a lawnmower playing in my head. So next up we have Dead Alive.
You've got the bite.
Oh, Fernando! Your mother ate my dog!
Not all of it.
The devil is amongst us. Stay back, boy. This calls for divine intervention. I kick ass for the Lord.
Party's over.
So, last on Part 1, we were going to discuss Dead Alive, which came out in 1992. Its actual name is Brain Dead. It's how it was known everywhere except for in North America. But we know it as Dead Alive. And so it came out in 1992, and basically a slapstick comedy horror film, I guess you call it.
Yep.
Did you want to, I guess, kind of go over some of the plot?
Yeah, sure. So Dead Alive begins as a period piece in 1957 with explorer Stuart McAlden, yes, who leads his team to Skull Island with a captured Sumatran rat monkey. And he actually gets bit by this Sumatran rat monkey. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing Sumatran. And then he goes back to his hometown.
It's a very Indiana Jones opening.
Very Indiana Jones. So the rat monkey gets shipped to the Wellington Zoo in New Zealand. And then in New Zealand, we pick up with a character named Lionel Cosgrove, played by Timothy Balm, who lives in a big mansion with his mother, Vera, who's a very domineering, kind of intense personality. And during that time, he also meets a young lady by the name of Paquita Maria Sanchez, and the two quickly start to develop a little bit of a romantic tension between them. So he takes her on a date, Paquita that is, to the Wellington Zoo, where his mother also goes along, and his mother, Vera, is bitten by the rat monkey and slowly starts to descend into a zombie.
Mm.
Yes.
Yes, she does.
Yes, she does. Oh, boy. So as we dig into this guy, it gets really crazy. His mother starts to turn into a zombie, and as other people start to come into their lives, it just kind of grows from there until we're faced with basically an army of zombies, and this movie gets really out of control and really gets to a level of gore that you pretty rarely see.
For sure. I mean, I saw some reviews where it's, they called it the bloodiest movie ever made or the goriest movie, and I would probably have to agree with that. I mean, yeah. It's pretty much wall to wall, gore. So yeah, I mean, that's the basic plot. Once again, as with the other two early films, plot is not the strongest point. It's kind of there just for him to go off and make a crazy ass movie.
And make a crazy ass movie he does.
with rabid rat monkeys and I mean, plenty of zombies. The second half of the film is pretty much all these zombies coming together in his house, and while his uncle, I believe, is trying to get the house after his mother
extorting him
passes away. Yeah, he's a horrible character. I'm glad he has the end that he does.
Yeah.
So it escalates much like Meet the Feebles, as it goes, kind of culminating in this ending, which we'll talk about later.
Very big infamous ending. Yeah.
Yes, very. It's very impressive. Also, the ending, I thought, from a practical standpoint.
Absolutely, this was his biggest budget film to date, correct?
It was. $3 million. Actually, was what the budget was reported to be on this one. And it's also his first film that was actually, when it came out, it was received fairly well by critics. It still bombed, of course. Financially, it did not do well. But the critics actually enjoyed this one, I think, because it's just so over the top, and you kind of know when you're watching it that it's they're in on the joke, sort of. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, what can we throw at you? And obviously this is all in the tone of a comedy. None of this should be taken seriously, and I think everyone kind of got that, which is actually, it's pretty rare for that to happen, but everyone seemed to be on the same page with it when it came out.
Yeah, I think that this one, what maybe attracted critics to it, is that it has this kind of unexplainable thing where it maybe just feels a little bit smarter. It feels like a somewhat more sophisticated artist working. Obviously, it was made for a little bit bigger of a budget than his previous films were made, but it also seems to be a little bit more self-aware. I think that if you watch Bad Taste or you watch Meet the Feebles, there seems to be maybe a little bit less enjoyment of the gore. The gore seems like the attraction, but there's not as much of a wink and a nod. The audience isn't necessarily as in on the gore. They're just more along for the ride. Whereas on Dead Alive or Brain Dead, it really feels like Jackson wants the audience to kind of just get swept up and be part of the gore. He wants them to be in there. You can even see it with the camera work, as the way he moves through the zombies, which Jackson, I think something he uses beautifully throughout his work is the POV shot. He'll start scenes with a POV shot, which is really interesting. Normally that's kind of reserved. You'll kind of work into that or that subjective camera rather. But whereas Jackson will just throw you right into a POV, and I think that he uses his POVs, but just also his storytelling in general, in a pretty masterful way to bring the viewer into the story on this one, rather than being a spectator from the outside.
Yeah, that was one of the things I actually noted. Is that his camera moves became more prevalent and like a lot more energy, even to the editing and everything. It's just you can tell it's a filmmaker that's learned a lot, and this one looks the most, I guess, mainstream out of the three that we're talking about in this episode. But it still carries on the same themes, extreme violence, dark humor, that he had in his previous films, just in a much more somehow over the top way. Yeah.
Yeah, he somehow managed to best himself.
Somehow, yeah.
Each of these early efforts. And in our next episode, we'll be talking about Heavenly Creatures, which is an interesting departure, but somehow still is still a pretty treacherous film. But we'll stay on Dead Alive for now. Yeah, he brings it to a new level. But what's interesting about Dead Alive, as opposed to something like Meet the Feebles, where Meet the Feebles, you have this huge catharsis, and the stories feel very real. I think that Jackson on this one really wanted it to feel like a fiction. He wanted it to be kind of rooted so far away from reality that you didn't even question for a second that it was a fiction, and just let yourself get lost in this gore, literally just washed in this bloody, disgusting, pulpy, strange mess.
Definitely. And he actually, I guess he didn't design the special effects makeup for this one. I'm sure he was involved in some way, but actually the person responsible for creating the makeup for this one is someone named Bob McCarran, sorry. And he also worked on some pretty notable films. He worked on The Matrix, Dark City, and also a movie I hope to cover on this very show someday, The Return of Captain Invincible. I don't know if you've seen that one, but
yeah, I haven't done that one yet.
It's very much a cult film. It's a musical. Actually, Richard O'Brien, who did the music for, who wrote Rocky Horror, did the music for that movie, and it's about an alcoholic superhero. So
interesting. Did he stick with Jackson through his concurrent films?
I don't believe so. It looked like he kind of went off and did his own thing. Apparently, he was also a medic and a wildlife enthusiast. So he was a man of many talents. I think he worked with the Olympics actually as a medic there. So I guess he kind of was involved with all different things. But the Matrix and Dark City were probably the two biggest ones I noticed on his resume.
I wonder if his background as a medic influenced how he approached scenes of gore and
That's
body horror. Yeah. I could be wrong, but wasn't Tom Savini, he was like a war photographer? I could be totally off the ball on this, but
I could totally see that though.
I think yeah, because it just seemed a little more real, and not that this one seems so particularly real, but there are some particularly
Oh yeah,
disturbing, just like really disturbing body horror moments.
there's some shots where you have to look away, like it's just it's yeah, it gets pretty grotesque, pretty gruesome.
Yeah, definitely some weird science in this one as well. One
Yeah.
thing that we talked about before is how in a Jackson, at least an early Peter Jackson movie, and I suppose a late Peter Jackson movie, I mean, if you look at Lord of the Rings, that's clearly its own set of rules and in its own world. But in this zombie movie, obviously Dead Alive is a zombie film. What's interesting is that our main character Lionel seems to be able to control the zombies by injecting them with a tranquilizer, an animal tranquilizer, and keeping them sedated, which is interesting because zombies obviously aren't living creatures. So it's kind of strange to me that for some reason this animal tranquilizer seems to work, and you have to kill them in a certain way, and some of them, their organs live on even after their bodies are just... So the set of rules for this one is a little bit all over the place, but that definitely leads to some weird, very weird science.
Although it ended up being an animal stimulant, didn't it? Ended up being like the opposite.
Yeah, something it like tranquilized them for a bit, and then
Yeah.
at some point it all kicked in.
But it's funny that you mentioned Lord of the Rings, because one of the interesting facts I saw about this film was that the opening with the Skull Island, which is obviously a King Kong reference there, he would later use that same location in the Lord of the Rings. It was actually in the Return of the King for the Paths of the Dead scenes.
Oh wow!
He actually shot in the same exact location, which is that's pretty interesting, I think. And that's we're gonna find a lot of things as we go through these films that while Lord of the Rings is its own thing and so different from these early films, there is some things that do carry over, and we'll talk about that more later.
Yeah, he definitely has a thumbprint that runs through. Maybe more so. I mean, I think we could definitely go as far as to call Jackson an auteur.
Definitely, I think so. Yeah,
we could definitely go that far, but it's interesting because it seems like there was a clear break at some point of it in his career where he kind of switched stylistically. It was like he was cruising right along. It was almost like Godard went to color, and all of a sudden there was like this hard. But at the same time, there is this clear thumbprint that runs straight through. And I think something that we mentioned earlier in this episode, or in this part rather, is that how he used New Zealand as he kind of would always paint a portrait of New Zealand. And I think that this is pretty present in this film as well.
Okay, so some other, just quick facts, interesting facts that I wanted to just kind of go through right now. This film was shot in 11 weeks. It all culminated with the shooting of the park scene, which was Jackson's favorite scene. He thought it was the funniest in the whole film. And it definitely does stand out with the zombie baby running around. And they put apparently like a good majority of their funds and their money from this film into that scene. They really just took their time with it. I believe they shot it over the course of a few days. And this movie is said to be, we talked about the gore factor in it, and this movie is said to be, the bloodiest of all time, actually measured in amount of actual film blood used in the production. 300 liters of fake blood was used in the final scene alone. So that gives you some idea of, just how much blood was pumping through this movie.
I wonder where that stacks up against like a Kill Bill Volume 1 or something like that. It's got to be pretty close, but I could believe that this one's more. Yeah.
So this movie, we were going to talk about this a little bit, but this was fairly successful in a way. I mean, when he released it in New Zealand, when it was initially released, this movie actually earned more per screen than Batman Returns, if you can believe that.
I can't believe that. That's crazy.
I couldn't believe it either, but maybe because it was someone from New Zealand making the film, everyone must have went out to see it. It must have been hyped a lot when it came out. And you were actually going to talk a little bit about the reviews of the time.
Yeah, so it was positively reviewed at the time. One thing that I saw, I don't know if this was a review from the actual time itself, but from the Roger Ebert site, from a review written by, I'm going to totally butcher her name, but it looks like Sung Young Cho, where she said some horror movies have mercy on uninformed audiences who have no idea what they will be about to get. The opening sequence of New Zealand horror film Dead Alive, 1992, which is also known as Brain Dead, is a good example because it kindly gives the audience a very clear idea of what it is about and how it is about to get it. So I think that what just something that she's saying that's great about Jackson and how he approached this film is there's just really no fear. He just lets you know. He creates his world immediately, and you're just in it. You're in it straight through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, much like the other films where we talked about plot not being a huge thing, the story is there, but it's more of like a means of jumping off. It's not really the point. Demented zombie babies spewing green goo is more the point in this film.
Yeah.
It kind of seems like.
Although there are some interesting things, if we're going to look at it from kind of our analytical standpoint, there are some interesting things thematically running along in this film, which is something I really like to try to do. Is when we have these horror movies, because I think that horror movies and cult movies in general that don't play by your standard dramatic cinematic rules can kind of use metaphor in a way that a lot of movies aren't able to do. They don't have to be as straight about things because they play by these off the wall, these off the wall settings and plots. So
Make their own rules, yeah.
Exactly, and I think there is some interesting stuff present in this film about the relationship of son to mother and kind of the room that a significant other plays in a young person's life versus a parent. And obviously we have this kind of competitive situation between Vera, the mother, and Paquita, the girlfriend, playing straight through.
There's some Freudian things going on.
Yeah, some very Freudian. Yeah, definitely about a young man trying to move on from the feeling that he needs his mother in his life, which is maybe something, I mean, I don't know, personally, it seems like Peter Jackson has a good relationship with his mother, considering that she let him, she was made dinner for him. Yeah, she was making dinner for him and his friends when they were making Bad Taste. Right. But, you look at him in the scope of his life, at this point, he's a young man really kind of going out onto his own. I mean, how old was he when he made this film? His early 30s, maybe?
Mm-hmm.
So
young,
he was young, so a young man kind of going out into the world and taking risks and learning about new things for the first time. It is an interesting thing to follow thematically as opposed to in context of his career.
Yeah, I mean, while there's not the story's not the most important part, you're right. There is themes that run through the film that are, I think important, and like the mother aspect is a huge thing. I mean, talk about Freud. He literally goes back into his mother at the end in a way.
Very strange.
And then is birthed out in a way. But there's lots of interesting themes going on for sure.
So as we talk about the end, because we're drawing to the end of our time here, so there is one scene in particular, similar to Meet the Feebles, that is the climax of the movie that we must talk about. And the reason I mentioned a lawnmower before is, well, because it involves a very, very bloody scene with a lawnmower. Mark, would you like to elaborate?
Well, there's a lawnmower, and it is used. The lawnmower blade, rather, is used to basically mow through the undead. Just cuts right through them. I like how he cuts through the crowd of zombies, and then he kind of takes a moment, just a beat there, and then he turns around and goes right back through them again. I mean, that part just really stands out.
Yeah, and the kind of the nonchalance is an interesting thing. As opposed to, if we look back at Meet the Feebles, which is this very cathartic, intense, dramatic scene, it's interesting how we move to this one, which is something that's present in a lot of zombie films, is that because they're so far detached at this point, that there is this nonchalance to the killing. He's just having fun with it. And I think that, that's something that Jackson at this point, as a filmmaker, was maybe doing too. It doesn't seem like there was a lot of pressure that he was imposing on himself necessarily with this film. He wasn't too precious with it. He really let himself just go wild and have fun on this one.
Yeah, and much like the Feebles, almost every scene in this stands out in some way. Did you have any particular favorite moments or scenes from this film?
So I did have a favorite moment in this one, and it wasn't a big, crazy moment like you would necessarily think, but there's a scene when his mother has just turned into a zombie, and we're just but she hasn't really started to change yet, and they have a couple of very posh New Zealand, like high-class, aristocratic dinner guests over, and they're eating a bowl of soup, and his mother's ear starts to slowly fall off her head and drops into the bowl of soup. And I know personally I'm very responsive to textures, and there was just something texturally. There aren't a lot of moments in films at this point in my life that I can say that genuinely make me cringe or look away, but I was eating breakfast when I was watching this movie, and I had to stop eating breakfast at that scene just because it was just the sound of the soup and the colors are just so unbelievably disturbing.
I would advise against eating at all during this film.
or any of these three films.
Any of these three films. Yes, totally. That's a good scene.
You'll get a bad taste in your mouth.
Exactly. Oh, I see what you did there.
Funny.
So yeah, that scene is funny and disgusting, and For me, a lot of the scenes that stood out, actually, the nurse scene. A lot of the scenes with the nurse were very funny. I thought, how the way her head kind of like flops back when he throws a wall ornament at her, and the way she keeps coming back afterwards. I mean, there's so much like utter ridiculousness and implausibility that's on display.
And the baby.
And the baby, of course. Yeah, the baby is just like a whole nother thing.
A zombie baby who is much larger than a normal newborn baby.
Yes. But it all adds to the fun. And I mean, this movie is a lot of fun. The nurse eating when she's eating food later and it's like oozing out of her, the slit in her neck is especially funny, but revolting.
It's kind of what it would be like if the Marx Brothers made a really gory zombie movie.
Oh yeah, there's plenty of there's actual jokes in the movie, like the zombies literally sucking face like on the dinner table when they're like making out with each other. And also the part where the main character is trying to run away from the zombies, but he's continually slipping and running in place on the blood that's on the floor. I feel like that kind of sums up the movie in a way. Yeah, it's just this kind of slapstick, like you mentioned, the Marx Brothers or Three Stooges, that kind of humor.
Yeah, and I think if you were to look at the influence of this movie, because now we're at a point in Jackson's career where people were actually really starting to see his films on a wider audience. I think if you look at somebody like an Edgar Wright, I can't imagine Shaun of the Dead existing, or Hot Fuzz existing without Brain Dead or Dead Alive.
I read that this film was a direct, was basically what inspired Shaun of the Dead. So
absolutely,
that totally makes sense. Shaun of the Dead seems tame compared to this one, though, I will say.
Yeah,
in the gore factor, but definitely the way that they incorporate zombies and comedy and gore and all that.
Very over the top.
Yeah, totally. And of course, the mom creature at the end. We can't talk about the film without talking about that. I would say besides the lawnmower blade, that would probably be the other main thing that sticks out. Besides the baby, of course, too. Is the way the film culminates with that climax.
Which is something you have to just see this particular part for yourself if you haven't. I hope you have, because if you haven't, we've already talked about a lot of the film, but it's just this mom creature is just totally over the top and bizarre.
It's huge, and the things that happens to her and that she does is just, you really do just have to watch it.
Definitely a visual.
Definitely a visual. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. Do you have anything else you wanted to add on Dead Alive?
No, I think we've pretty much put it out there. Just go see it yourself. Highly recommend all three of these films. Really.
Yes,
really
I do as
ride.
well. And one thing I did want to add is I kick ass for the Lord.
I kick ass for the Lord.
Which has to be the best line in the movie.
That's not, yeah.
Because it's said by a priest. So that would be part 1 of our 2-part series. Next time, we're going to talk about the late early films of Peter Jackson, which would include Heavenly Creatures and The Frighteners.
Yes.
All leading up to, of course, The Lord of the Rings, which we're not going to talk about, but you can find plenty on that if you would like to.
And we mention it, but
we'll talk about a little bit.
We'll talk a little bit, but
we'll tie it all together. But
yeah.
All right. Well, this has been Cult Movie Cult. Thank you very much for listening. You can join us next time for the next part in this series on Peter Jackson, called Before Middle Earth: The Early Films of Peter Jackson. And feel free to find us on iTunes, Facebook, and various other forms of social media. Jeremy, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Just thanks for listening. Once again, you just listened to part 1 of our episode Before Middle Earth, the early films of Peter Jackson. You listened to the early films. Next time we will be discussing the late early films. So once again, you've been listening to Cult Movie Cult, where we watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat out strange from the other side of cinema.
See you next time from the other side.